Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and welcome to the stage our fantastic speakers. We're going to meet some of the authors and literary people who've really looked into this issue in their own works. And I'm going to hand over to my fantastic colleague, Paul Cann, who's a co-founder of the Campaign to End Loneliness. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Janet. Welcome back, everybody. I think I'm here because... I'll check that one. Because I think it was 10 years ago, almost exactly to the day, that I was in a room when Andrew Barnett from the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation invited a few people from the voluntary sector in to talk about loneliness. So yes, he invited a number of people into this room. I've no idea whether I was invited to that meeting or not. So the campaign's made great strides since that meeting 10 years ago in terms of building awareness and understanding. And I think in particular, we now understand the fact that this issue of loneliness is a universal. It was another fine writer, Olivia Laing, who's recently written about loneliness and described it as a collective, a city. We're all in this together, she says, this accumulation of scars and this temporary heaven we have, which so often resembles hell. And what matters is kindness. And she drew the attention to this very, very clearly. Each of our three authors this afternoon, Libby Page, Kate Lever, and Nick Duerden, they all cover this issue of loneliness across the ages in very different ways as a universal human condition. But I think what's great is they also really attack the so what question. You know, we now understand it, we have a grasp of its severity, so what are we going to do about it? And each of them is passionate and practical at the same time. Now, I'm the sort of chairman of this panel, and so it's my job to be honest and ruthlessly objective when I say that each of these books is a wonderful read, representing remarkable value for money, and available for all good bookshops, and also outside. So please pursue that. I can thoroughly recommend each of the books. We've had a completely terrifying instruction from the conference management team about time management. So there's just time to hear from each author very briefly, and they will each read a passage. And I'm just going to turn, first of all, to Libby Page, to hear from you. I have to warn you with this book, there may be something called a Kleenex alert at times, but a wonderful book. Libby, would you like to tell us about the Lido?
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. So the Lido is my first novel, and it is about the somewhat unlikely friendship between 86-year-old Rosemary, who has swum at her local Lido in Brixton all of her life, and 26-year-old Kate, who is a local journalist and is assigned the story of the potential closure of the Lido to write about. And it's really their passion for saving this important community space where people from all backgrounds that come together, but also their own experiences of loneliness that bring them together and form this friendship. And I think that's something that I really wanted to cover in the book, this idea that although, you know, the two characters seemingly are from very different worlds, that feeling of what it feels like to be lonely unites us all really, and whether you're 26 or 86, that feeling is still the same, and it's still something that we all need to kind of reach out to other people in order to cure, I guess. So I'm just going to read a brief passage which talks about Kate's experience of loneliness. So she is the younger character, and I guess in some ways a less likely candidate for loneliness. Rosemary, who's 86, is recently bereaved, so is experiencing loneliness from a very different perspective, and yet Kate, this kind of young woman who's just moved to the city for the first time, is still feeling that same kind of crippling loneliness. As Kate walks, she imagines that somewhere in the city, someone like her sits in their room alone and eats peanut butter from the jar. She wonders if any of these strangers would understand her if she told them the things she can't tell her family, that some days she doesn't want to get up at all and that she has forgotten what it feels like to be happy. Of course, she won't admit to anyone that she's lonely. You're not supposed to be lonely in your 20s. Your 20s are making friends for life and having inappropriate boyfriends and reckless holidays where you drink shots off each other's stomachs, having the best time. She watches on Facebook as people celebrate birthdays and go out, and it seems like they really are having the time of their lives. From her phone screen, they seem to sparkle. It's as though all the life has been served up to other people and there are no scraps left for her. Or at least that's how it feels. She doesn't tell anyone that often she feels like a sad, matted teddy bear you might see forgotten on under a bench on the underground. She just wants someone to pick her up and take her home.
Well, I warned you about the emotional content of that book, and I have to say, Libby, the heart-rending, desolate description of the bedsit with no other people, evidence that they're around, but no sign of them, it just reminded me of one of those paintings by Edward Hopper of individuals stuck alone in buildings. But Kate Lever's book, The Friendship Cure, is equally emotionally warm in a different way, and I think very, very passionate. And if you're in a hurry, first of all, you have to buy the book, but if you're in a hurry, go straight to page 291, I think it is, where Kate calls us to action and talks about friendship as being our hope and our salvation, and perhaps the one chance we have of saving us from ourselves. Kate, great book.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I guess in 2015, I read an article. I was sitting in Hyde Park, and I read an article that was called something to the effect of How We Lose Friendship as We Age. And it was in The Atlantic by a journalist called Julie Beck. And she argued that as we get married and have kids and get older, we deprioritize friendship, and that is part of why we have a loneliness epidemic. Essentially, it really frightened me. I just moved here from Sydney and I was hyper aware of how important my own friendships were to me, certainly for a sense of belonging. And it essentially sent me headfirst into a year-long binge of research. And I wrote an 83,000-word reply to that article. So I spoke to my own friends, I spoke to strangers from the internet, I spoke to pop scientists and evolutionary psychologists. So a real mix. I wanted to be able to write a book in which I could talk about the science of loneliness and friendship, and definitely the new sort of research on the physical aspects of those things, but also put forward my theory for why Monica and Chandler shouldn't have ended up together in the TV show Friends. So it's got a bit of everything. I'd like to read you a little bit. I think one of our biggest problems with loneliness is being able to articulate exactly how it feels. It's one of our sort of more complex corners of human nature. So I wanted to share with you just a couple of examples of how some people I spoke to described their own loneliness. These are probably my two favourite descriptions of loneliness. So the first is from a woman called Amy. It's not her real name, I had to change it, which I kind of like. It makes me feel like a spy. Okay, so when I ask Amy to describe loneliness to me as though I'm someone who has never experienced it myself, she asks if I've ever been to a silent disco. Yes, I have, I say. Hundreds of people turn up at a big venue and dance, only they're all wearing headphones and dancing to the music that blares through them. So you have this eerie experience where you can slip your headphones down around your neck, away from your ears, and watch people dancing in complete silence. Amy says she saw one once at a festival, and it made her feel brittle and sick, because it reminded her so strongly of how she feels in all social situations. Loneliness, to Amy, is like going to a silent disco, but she's the only one without any music playing in her headphones. It's alienating, it's isolating, it makes her the only person unable to sway or swing or boogie to the same beat as everyone else. I love this description of loneliness. It's so perfectly bleak. Imagine the sort of panic you'd feel if you were the only one in a room of hundreds unable to hear what everyone else is hearing. This second one is from a man called Dave. Dave can actually pinpoint a moment of extreme loneliness in his life. It was the 23rd of April 2009. He was in a hostel in Portugal and someone had just teased him about reading David Beckham's memoir. He remembers lying back on his little bunk bed and feeling utterly alone and like an imposter. I jump on that phrase when he says it because that's an important part of the loneliness experience, feeling like you don't belong, like you're an imposter in your own life. The way Dave explains it, loneliness is a void, an emptiness, a hollowness. It's that sense of languishing in the space between the versions of ourselves we save for other people. Dave actually feels pangs of loneliness most days, usually when he's sitting on the train on the way home from work, in between being work Dave and home Dave. I love that he makes this distinction between Daves because it makes loneliness out to be this strange space we occupy when we're not performing our public and private selves. It's what happens when we press pause on our identities and we don't know for a moment who we are. I feel like everyone's watching but no one is paying attention, Dave says, rather aptly describing the feelings of paranoia and negligence that so often accompany loneliness. It's the silent disco scenario all over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. I mean, that silent disco analogy is just brilliant and so true to that experience of being outside and sensing that other people are having a great time, enjoying life. And Nick, if I can say this, what I particularly liked about your book was the way you very targeted and you understand the specific groups and their specific situations so well. For example, a chapter in your book called Baby Blues tackles this huge thing about the loneliness of mums at home with small children. Could have described my daughter with her 3 small children at home. Your chapter called University Challenged, absolutely going to the heart of the student experience, which perhaps is becoming increasingly isolated. It could have described my niece last year going to university in a faraway place. So thank you for that. And would you like to share with us something about your book, A Life Less Lonely?
Hello, everybody. It was about this time last year I was asked if I wanted to write a book about loneliness. And the idea was to help cement the legacy of Jo Cox MP and to continue her conversation. So I threw myself into the research. And the first place I came was here, and I heard you talk and interview a panel much like this. And I met a lot of people like you all today who just do the most amazing work for all sorts of people all over the country and then all over the world. So I've spent the last year talking to these people. I kind of wanted to get behind the headlines if I could, and I wanted the book to be emotionally resonant. So I've talked to all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds, different ages, different class, about what it's like to be lonely, how they found themselves with loneliness and feeling socially isolated, and also how they learn to live with it, but then also get out of it. And I hope that by telling their stories, we might recognize ourselves in the pages, but also take inspiration from them. And what I liked so much about a lot of the initiatives that a lot of you work on is the more in common idea that we can all just reach out, we can all do something. I know that many people wear badges to say happy to talk, and other people hug, and other people go to all sorts of evenings out, but not all of us are that. I'm quite shy and quite awkward, and I thought, well, that's not really for me. But the more I researched, the more I thought, well, I could do something as well, and I can reach out, and I can become more socially connected. Because I think I realized while researching the book that I'm quite socially isolated myself. I'm a writer, I work from home, I hardly see anybody, the phone doesn't go anymore, hardly anybody knocks on the door, everything is online. So I thought, well, I could get out as well a bit more. So I tried to take the advice of the book, and I think it would be a year before we got the book, we got a dog, and I would go out and I'd throw the ball, the dog would fetch it to me, then we'd go back home again. And my wife was the one, as ever, in our relationship to say, look, go out there and socially reconnect. It's not a bad thing. You can still make friends. And so I tried it. And to my surprise, it worked. And that's the passage I would like to read out, if I may, just to suggest that if I can pull my finger out and do it, anybody can. And you all know this, but lots of us out there may think it's a leap too far. I couldn't possibly go and do that, but you can. And I did. So I start with, as a lifelong city dweller, I'm used to being unfriendly and standoffish to almost everybody. I don't talk to neighbours, I never broach a conversation on a tube or a train. I would occasionally make exceptions on transatlantic flights, but only with Americans, because Americans rarely stop talking. Context for an embedded Londoner is everything. So while I am still unlikely to find the appropriate words to exchange with people in the post office queue, I will happily talk to pretty much any dog that arrives in the park with their owner at the end of a leash. Context. It's the dog that permits the conversation to start. The fresh air that surrounds us provides the follow-through oxygen. I will go to the park for half an hour and come back 90 minutes later having lost all track of time and enjoyed more meaningful conversations with dog owners, whose names I very often fail to learn, than I have had with friends for years. There is the part-time actress and the reluctant nanny, the narcoleptic window cleaner, the entrepreneurial Indonesian with her melancholy basset hounds, and the lovely Indian widow. And then there is the early retiree with psoriasis and arthritis, whose bulldog can dribble a basketball the way Messi does a football. We stand around and applaud. Some of these people have revealed to me their secrets, their confessions and yearnings, their transgressions with the law. I've shared plenty of my own. Some connections have become unaccountably deep. 3 laps of the park, all that's required to encourage full disclosure of matters intimate and private. Until we got the dog, I thought my ability to talk to strangers had receded badly with age. It's sometimes nice to be proved wrong.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. Three wonderful readings. Thank you very much. I'm not actually going to ask Professor Holt-Lundstad to comment on the evidence base around Americans never stopping talking. But we can just take that one as read for the time being. So we have 3 brilliant authors and a bit of time to ask questions. I'm going to kick off, and this will probably turn into a free-for-all. Please, if you have a question, can you make yourself very, very clear to me? That would be great. And I'd like to start with Libby, please, because I think the Lido is as a symbol of community spaces, things which draw people together for fun, for social connection, is a stroke of genius. What do we need to do to protect these community spaces, do you think? Should we take a leaf out of Kate's book? Should we be more activist, more angry? What do you think we should do to have more Lidos?
That's a big question. I guess the reason I wanted to write about the Lido is because it is, it's a kind of symbol in a way of all those amazing community spaces that bring people of all backgrounds together. I also touch on libraries, and there's a secondhand bookshop in there, which is also a kind of hub of the community. But as an outdoor swimmer myself, I do find that there's something about being stripped down to your swimwear that immediately kind of breaks down barriers, and you're kind of more inclined to speak to people. And I have amazing chats with people in the changing rooms. And I guess it's that, the fact that the swimmers there really get that and really form friendships with one another, that they then feel compelled to try and save it, because it isn't just a pool to them, it's a place where all their social connections are kind of played out. And although this is a fictional book, there are so many stories like that around the country of places like that, and particularly Lidos being threatened, but local people coming together to try and save it, and actually in a way that the campaigning itself is a way to kind of stave off loneliness, because it's when you meet people in your local area who you might not have ever encountered otherwise.
It was about 10 years ago that Julia Neuberger, Baroness Rabbi Julia Neuberger, wrote a book called Not Dead Yet, in which she said, we're just not angry enough. We're not campaigning enough. I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly a very good story about community activism in your book. I now need to turn to a subject which causes me personally some difficulty, which is men. Kate, in your book, you quote this statistic that women are 30% more likely than men to offer support to someone going through a crisis who needs particular support. And of course, when I read that, I thought, no, this can't possibly be true. But Nick also does have a chapter called, I think, The Problem with Men. So there's obviously something in it. What can we do to draw men out of their loneliness, do you think? How could men emulate women more? What is the answer to men?
The answer to men. How long have you got? No, I think, look, having reflected on the men in my own life, but also having spoken to a number of different academics on the subject, I think there is a sort of crisis of vulnerability or lack thereof among men. And I think it's partly to do with how we raise men, because I think at the moment we're raising young boys to be stoic and unfeeling. One of the academics that I spoke to has spent 30 years speaking to teenagers about their feelings on friendship. And one day a 16-year-old said to her, "How nice it must be to be a girl, you'll be allowed to feel things." And she repeated that quote to me several times throughout our interview because it stayed with her over the years. And I think that's an extremely common experience for men, this feeling that they have to be unbreakable and untouchable and invincible, and that their sort of ideals of masculinity are tied up with these ideas of everything being fine and then being brave and stoic and untouchable. And I think it's really important for so many reasons, including loneliness, for us to break down that kind of conditioning that we put young boys through. A couple of academics I spoke to also sort of spoke to me about how throughout childhood, boys tend to want the same sort of friendship that we associate traditionally with women, the same sort of close, confidant kind of relationship where you feel intimately close to your best friend. And then when they hit adolescence, they kind of lose both their ability and their open desire to have relationships like that. So it's sort of about harking back to that childhood desire for intimacy and the ability to be vulnerable and open. And I think we have a lot of work to do in the loneliness space, and also we're doing a lot of work in the mental health space, because as we know, suicide is an incredibly huge risk for men, and particularly middle-aged men. So I think we have a lot of work to do in encouraging men to be more vulnerable. And if that means, emulating a more traditionally feminine approach, then yes, I think that is the answer.
Great. Fascinating. Thank you. Right, noted. And Nick, just finally with you, you give us a lot of directions and pointers in your book about places to go to get help and all of that. And you talk about a number of mechanisms by which which create excuses for talking, for getting people together. I loved the story of was it Jessica who got one of these badges that says, "I talk to strangers," and she put it on, but then forgot that she was wearing it. And one day, a random stranger came up to her, and she ran 1,000,000 miles away from him. And it was rather telling, that story, I think. But do we need more mechanisms? Do we need badges? What do we need, do you think?
We need to find ways to engage more, and that's quite difficult. Jessica decided that for her, the badges didn't work. And I may be wrong in saying this, but I spoke to somebody who'd worked in city planning in Vancouver who said that they had started these badges as well. And after a while, they decided it didn't work for them because it seems a little bit happy-clappy. If you're walking around with a badge, you think, "Oh, I'm not good." But the idea behind it was a very pure and good one. Think, look, we are happy to talk. Let's look up from our phones. So, yeah, a development more of third spaces. And just to echo what Kate was saying, and my chapter, the problem with men is that men are so... The men that I spoke to, or the men that I couldn't speak to, but I learned about, their identities are so tied up with their work that once work ends for them, either through ill health or retirement, they tend to fall off the social map. They're not joiner-inners in the way that women are. So one of the men I spoke to had to leave work early because of illness, and he was an alcoholic and he wasn't allowed to drink anymore. But he said, "Well, all my friends are through those doors in the pub. So if I can't see them anymore, what do I do?" So for some reason he had a social worker, and the social worker said, "Well, look, there's a bingo hall down there." And he had to explain to him politely and then not so politely that bingo wasn't for him. And he ended up in a men's shed. And so that was this third space. A men's shed are these wonderful initiatives that allowed him to almost mimic the role he inhabited at work, now for pleasure. So he wasn't making anything of particular note, but it gave him something to do. And because he had worked as a carpenter, he was able to kind of be the unofficial gaffer. And it gave him a sense of identity back. Basically, it got him out of the house. And I get the sense that most people need to be able to get out of the house and actually have a destination in mind to go to, something that at the end of wherever they're traveling to, they'll find fulfillment. And they don't always find that fulfillment at home on the sofa in front of Countdown.
Thank you. We've got a little bit more time for questions that people might have, and you may be around a little bit longer this afternoon for people to talk, but do we have any questions on any of the issues that have been raised now, or some of the issues, for example, that cropped up in the books, like the stigma of saying, I'm feeling lonely, how unacceptable that is? Does that resonate with you? Or the issue of technology, I think is quite interesting. Is technology a foe or a friend here? Those are issues. But we have one here. We've got Michelle, I think. Hi. We've got a mic coming down here, Michelle. Anybody else? Yeah.
Wow.
This is a good way of introducing Michelle Dawson, aging Middlesbrough.
Hello, I don't think, is that on? Okay, that's on. I'm interested in, when we talk about the stigma of feeling lonely, whether or not from your perspective, whether you feel like the people that you spoke to recognised the feelings that they had were loneliness. I think part of the issue, especially if you're younger, is that unless someone has a very explicit conversation with you about loneliness, you know, you can look back and think, actually, during that period of time, I was really lonely, but at the time, there's no way I would have recognised those feelings of loneliness. Do you think that when you were writing your perspective books, that was some of the challenge around trying to talk to people trying to meet people who might have felt lonely, but possibly had never attributed that language to that feeling before? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very quick responses?
I mean, I think it's a very valid point that people at that stage don't necessarily recognise it as loneliness. And, you know, from a personal perspective, I put a lot of my own experience of being lonely and moving to a big city into this book. And but it's only since the book's been published and I've kind of shared it with friends that they've said, yeah, actually, I felt exactly the same way. And, you know, at the time, I thought that they were having a great time. And it's only now, several years later, that they can look back and be honest about it, because they would perhaps have been too kind of ashamed to admit those feelings at the time, but also, perhaps you're right, to identify it as such. That I guess if you haven't been through that experience before and having gone through kind of the education system where actually you are surrounded, you know, often you go to this, you know, primary school with the same people and then on to secondary school, perhaps you haven't experienced it in that same way. So maybe that is part of the problem, that, yeah, people don't necessarily know that they're experiencing it until afterwards, and then when other people say, yeah, that's
It does seem to be receding, which is the great thing now. Now that it's become part of the national conversation and it's staying there, because a lot of the people I spoke to hadn't recognised it. People told them that was it, because they thought immediately, I'm just depressed. Depression was the word that we all reached at.
Yeah.
But you don't necessarily become depressed out of loneliness. You have to, you know, it has to become chronic loneliness before you develop depression, or so I was told. So, yes, it doesn't have to be that. But yeah, it was, people just didn't recognise. It wasn't a word, the L word wasn't something that dawned on them.
I think we need to learn how to ask the right questions as well. I mean, the people I spoke to for the book, most of them, it was the first time they'd ever admitted to being lonely, and I was a complete stranger to them. And so it took me saying, have you had an experience of loneliness? Would you like to speak to me? For them to be able to open up. So that said to me, in a kind of alarming way, that we're not giving people the chance to even speak the words that they're frightened to speak. So perhaps they don't recognise the feeling themselves, perhaps they don't have the words, but at the moment they also don't have the channel through which to speak about it, or the person in their life they think they can go to. So I think we have a lot of work to do there as well.
Time for just one quick question from here, please.
Who is this on? It's sort of a comment. I faced an indeterminate time where my husband would either live or die because he was waiting for transplant plant. And I used social media in a positive way, and I wanted to put a word in for social media. I set up a hidden group on Facebook of people who knew, and it was literally called the Group of People Who Know, and said what I was going through and that at any point I might call on them for help. But what actually happened is that people came to me in case I needed help, to check on me, usually by phone, sometimes physically. And what's happened subsequently, including with, there were men and women on that group, including with the men, is I found that they, when they're going through a period of loneliness, have started coming to me and saying, can I talk to you about it? It's just a comment. I don't know that there's an answer to that.
I'm getting slightly confused messages from ground control, which I think means we've got a little bit more time for some more questions. So let's go there.
Hi, Tracy Robbins from Eden Project Communities. I think we spoke, Nick.
Hello.
I'm just, we're the people behind the big lunch and we bring people together for fun, but I'm just really interested. Earlier today, we talked a lot about agency, and I thought Michelle was going to ask the question around the conversation we're having about lunchtime. So we were having a nice chat about how loneliness has moved about anybody, anywhere, and life transitions, and that's really recognised. But actually is looking at loneliness in isolation, actually siloing loneliness off from the other factors that people face. So we were very aware there are loads of barriers that stop people from connecting. Poverty, language, different cultures that we've touched on today. We're also aware that there's huge cost implications of trying to keep people together. And actually, if you're living in below the breadline and really struggling, the last thing you have is agency or the ability to make decisions, and actually being proactive, volunteering might be the last thing that is on your radar. And we were just a little bit concerned, actually, where does loneliness and agency fit in those marginalised groups? Because I haven't heard of them spoken much today.
Okay, would anybody like to pick up on that?
I have to say, I
mean, it's a very valid point.
It's a huge
and
question.
Yeah, it is a huge
everything's
question.
so connected, isn't it? That you're totally right. You know, you're not going to necessarily go and volunteer if your time is, you know, you need to be working to put food on the table and that's your priority. Like, of course you're not going to go and look for extra things because you don't have time to do that. And I think it's very right to kind of widen the questions and think, what are the barriers to social connection that are then leading to loneliness? Which is, I mean, not really an answer other than yes, you're very. I think that's very valid.
I think also what you just raised is not something that a bunch of authors can solve. I think we need to get people like Tracy, who spoke earlier today, on board with that. And I think the enormity of the issues that you've just raised is a reminder of how much we need government intervention in the issue of loneliness, and also how tightly wed it is to issues of poverty, and how it is a class issue, essentially. Although I would say, of course, that loneliness doesn't discriminate by postcode or income or anything like that. It's a very sneaky bastard. It can get you in a crowded room or a party, as well as when you're socially isolated. So I would only say that you're absolutely right, and so very valid for bringing up those points. But I would say that is all the more reason why we cannot do this alone, and why speaking about it is essentially not enough. We need to raise awareness and we need to have the conversation, but beyond that, we need tangible action from government resources and government bodies that enable people to be able to seek social interaction in a safe and cost-effective way. I'm hoping, days like this will start that conversation, which I think is a really important one.
We used to talk a lot more and should talk more about this thing called social exclusion, which is a multiplicity of things which disadvantage people, and loneliness doesn't sit as a narrow issue, and we should always relate it to that wider context, which a report by the Campaign to End Loneliness called Promising Approaches to Tackling Loneliness. I don't know if you read that. That was describing the whole thing as a system, and you have to look at the whole system if you're to make real inroads on loneliness for individuals, particularly those who lack agency. So I think we're now officially out of time, so I'm going to draw it to a close, but I really wanted to thank our three authors very much indeed. I start by just agreeing with Kate about her views, that thing about the men and the research she quotes. I'm not at odds with you on that, Kate. From my own personal experience, on the 6:47 train home the other night, I had my own experience of emotional trauma when I knocked my cup of tea over. And this may not feel like death or divorce, but it was pretty damn embarrassing. And what happened was there was a young guy, smartphone, laptop, just opposite me, and a young woman across the aisle, smartphone, laptop. And before my cup of tea had even hit the ground completely, the young woman had smiled sympathetically, produced an entire packet of handy Andes, and said, take as many as you want. The guy had not moved, had not flinched, not a flicker of male solidarity. This is the kind of thing that happens to us men, nothing like that. In fact,
That was me.
I thought he might be dead, but anyway. So I think it's not 30% more likely, I think it's 100% more likely, but that's just my sample size of one. So I just would like to thank Libby, Kate, and Nick very much indeed. And whether it's, taking Kate's words about friendship being our hope and salvation, taking that forward, or Nick, who talks about modestly, I think, talking about continuing the Joe Cox conversation, and he says the conversation is ongoing, join it, or whether we just need to do more outdoor swimming. Come on in, the water's lovely. Anyway, thank you, each of you, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.